Have any questions come in, Steve?
We do have a number of questions, and if it's okay, I'm going to start back with some questions that I missed for Dr. Lawrence. She's still on?
I am. Yep.
All right, good. First question, looking for what would be a good low fructan forage. We have laminitic and PPID horses in my herd.
Right. So as Dr. Smith mentioned, warm season grasses like Bermuda grass are typically low in sugars that could trigger a glucose response or and they're also low in fructans, which can upset the large intestine. So that's one way to go. Alternatively, I think you want to select, if your horses are, it's a little bit of a plus minus, but if your horses are on the plump side, then you should be looking for forages that are in a later stage of maturity. So ones that have more stems, seed heads, things of that nature, because they are going to be less digestible. They typically will be lower in both sugar and fructan than some of the others. And so, as I said, that in our hands, orchard grass tends to be the lowest of the ones that we tend to look for. But again, if you can find a warm season hay like Bermuda grass, that would be a good way to go.
And so, Laurie, in a pasture, resting that pasture, letting the grass grow taller, letting it grow for a month before putting them out. That would be a benefit then for that type of horse.
So again, I think it's important to realize that it's not just composition, but it's composition times intake. And so when you increase the amount of forage mass that's out there, what they can do, so even if the concentration of fructan is low, if they eat a lot of it, it's going to be the same as eating a smaller amount of something that was lower. So, I have a little slide in my presentation that says there's only two kinds of horse pastures, not enough and too much. And I think that is, it really depends upon what kind of horse you have. And if you have a horse that's laminitic, and a horse that's overweight and a horse that has metabolic issues, then well-managed pastures maintained in a vegetative state are not desirable. And I know that's not pasture management advice, but that's nutrition advice.
Before I go into the next question, just want to encourage everyone to take the survey. There's a link in the chat box, and there's also a QR code there on the slide. So we'd like to have your feedback. It helps us for future planning. Next question is over my head, but hopefully you'll know what it means. Studies have shown that it is the ESC, not the WSC, that spikes the insulin. Thoughts on that?
Right. Can I share my screen?
Should be good now, Dr. Lawrence. Okay. Unshared.
Okay, so when you, let me go change this. Okay, can you guys see that? Yes.
Yes.
Nod your head.
Yes.
Nod your head. Okay, so if you send your forage out for an analysis, you're going to get back a report that has a bunch of terms on it that don't make any sense. And so if you're thinking about trying to measure the amount of lignin and cellulose, those really indigestible carbohydrates, you're going to ask for an analysis called acid detergent fiber. And if you want to look at lignin and cellulose and hemicellulose, you're going to look at neutral detergent fiber. If you're going to measure sugar, so this would be the sugars that can easily be absorbed as glucose from the forage, you're going to measure ethanol soluble carbohydrates. That's the lab method that captures those. Okay. If you measure water soluble carbohydrates, that captures both the sugar and the fructan. So if you are looking for something that's actually going to raise blood glucose levels, you're really looking at the sugar component, which was the ethanol soluble carbohydrates. If you're looking for sugar plus fructan, then you're looking for this combination of water soluble carbohydrates. And that's just that, those are just the analyses that are out there to do that. And so if you're looking for a low sugar hay and you're really worried about sugar, then you're looking at ethanol soluble carbohydrates. If you're looking at sugar plus fructan, which I think is a good thing if you have a laminitic horse, because there can be some GI associated things with that, then you probably want to look at those two things combined. And of course, if you subtracted your ethanol soluble carbohydrates from the water soluble carbohydrates, theoretically that would give you fructan. Doesn't exactly work that way, but that's that. So understanding the carbohydrate analysis terms on your forage analysis are important in terms of understanding which carbohydrates you're looking for. And starch is just analyzed as starch. A long answer, sorry.
Thank you. This question sounds more like desperation than anything else. What are there times of year when I don't have to limit pastures?
When they're covered in snow, I think if talking about, you know, horses that are overweight and horses that are laminitic, you know, even today here in central Kentucky, yesterday we had a deluge of rain. And if you have a nicely managed pasture that's not underwater, there's a lot of green grass out there because today was warm. And so those horses will eat that. So unless it's, you know, covered in snow and it's not available to them, I think you would be hard. You couldn't count on a time of year, perhaps other than maybe when it's 0 degrees, that they couldn't be consuming something that you didn't want them to. For that group of horses, the laminitic, the overweight, metabolic syndrome horses, you know, for the normal average horse, you know, those things aren't really an issue.
This question, maybe Dr. Smith could jump into here too. It's in terms of pasture planting, what considerations would you have for a farm with both cattle and horses?
So the forages I talked about, and we have on that publication establishing horse pastures, the tall fescue, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass are all going to fit for both. Rarely, though, do we plant Kentucky bluegrass in a cattle pasture just because it's not as productive. It would still work and still be nutritious. The other thing is that cattle can handle hard, they can handle the Kentucky 31 tall fescue and the toxins better than horses. So, particularly than pregnant horses. So pregnant horses have issues with tall fescue, just the kind of natural type that's a Kentucky 31 type. So for both cattle and horses, I would just say to make sure that you're planting the novel endophyte tall fescues, the new types of fescues that have good survival, but don't have the toxin or the endophyte. So the long and the short answer is a good cattle pasture is going to be a good horse pasture. The management things I talked about fit for both.
I've got some questions for Dr. Witt. You may have covered this, but what is the best product and timing for controlling ironweed?
There are several products. Generally, we're talking about spraying ironweed when it's about 18 inches tall or so, and either Pasture Guard, Graze On Next, or Duracor will all give excellent control of that weed at those times.
And Bill, I guess the benefit to the Pasture Guard is you wouldn't have the long residual that you would have with the other two that have the aminopyrrolid. I mean, as far as the carryover and the
carryover is certainly less with that. So yeah, that's true, and that's no real problem. Other than I think these other two might give you a few other weeds that go along with that at that time, a little better weed control there. But the Pasture Guard or any of those three products is quite good.
Okay.
You expect 90% plus control with those products.
Another question for Dr. Witt. We are composting all muck and have used Graze On Next in pastures. we be concerned about spreading compost back onto pasture since it is an aminopyrrolid?
No, no problem with that at all. In fact, that is part of that forage and manure management, is to put it back on the fields in which it came from. So that's not a problem.
The problem would come if you put it on your vegetable garden.
Or any other thing other than a wheat, a wheat field.
Next question. Has anyone been seeing an insurgence of ragwort within their pasture weeds?
I don't have any experience of seeing much ragwort at all, but then I don't see as many pastures as a lot of other people do. Ray, I don't know that I've seen that on any of the the farms y'all are evaluating.
No, I don't remember that, Bill, except for an occasional one. If there's someone else that's on, maybe someone with one of the ag companies, Debbie or somebody, feel free to comment if you've been seeing that. So I guess the answer is no, Steve. Though
No,
we have
okay.
seen some pretty odd weeds in certain fields. So do make sure if you see something you don't know to get it to your county agent for identification.
Next question. I'm a little worried about spraying my pastures because we are not far from our neighbors' beehives.
Assuming we're spraying herbicides, I don't know of any herbicide that's going to kill the bees. Now, it may kill a lot of the plants that they forage on, but I'm not aware of anything from that standpoint.
So the real issue with bees would be an insecticide that would be used on some crops or maybe an alfalfa field. But with pastures, we really have almost no occasion to spray an insecticide unless there's an infestation of fall armyworm. It's the only one I can really think of, Bill.
Yeah.
Steve and Dr. Smith, I think there was a second part to that question too. I don't know if you got that, Steve, but they were asking about overseeding as an option. Yeah.
So what to overseed, or
The question in regards to spraying their weeds, because they use overseeding as an option to control weeds, which I think you touched on a little bit in your presentation.
so definitely I'll let Bill follow up on this, but if you have limited weed issues, then they're not kind of taking over your field or big patches in your field, then grazing close and overseeding in September, getting a good thick stand is going to be one of the best controls, making sure you have a good rest period. The limitation would be that if the weeds are out of control, then it's hard just to say I'm going to overseed and control the weeds. And so that's where the things Bill talked about. Often it becomes necessary to have these occasional sprays of herbicides, and then overseed if you've had the resting period. Bill, any follow up on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. Just if you've got, like I say, if you have a tremendous amount of weeds in any of these pastures, try to get them under some control before you go to the overseeding, because you're going to be disappointed, I think, the following year with the amount of weeds that will return.
Now, I'll add one thing to that. I mentioned briefly perennial ryegrass that survives 2 years in pastures, comes up very quickly, very vigorous. It can be seeded in the fall or in the spring because it's so vigorous it'll grow in the spring. So if you're saying maybe I'm reluctant to use herbicides, or what's the most aggressive grass, then perennial ryegrass is a good option. The limitation is you're going to have to continue to do that every year or two to give that added growth and that added competition. So just keep that in mind. In areas that are grazed closely or areas around a fence or water, perennial ryegrass can be a way to kind of cover that soil when you know that it's going to be down to dirt again before long. So just adding that in.
Okay, Dr. Smith, I think we're into your questions now. Question, I tested my fields and have put lime on in November. So when can I reseed for horse pasture? Early spring?
So yeah, the next time would be early spring. There's no real wait period after putting the lime before you plant. So you're looking at early March, even late February if we continue to have a mild winter and you've got some good days. But definitely looking at the first 1, 2, 3 weeks of March to get the seed there in the ground. I mentioned the value of a no-till seed drill. That's the best method. Sometimes we get into really wet periods. It's hard to get a drill out there. If you do broadcast seed, then it makes a big difference to drag that field to try to get the seed covered. So I'd rather use a no-till drill, but if that doesn't work for one reason or other, then make sure that you at least have dragged the field to cover the seed.
Next question, what criteria do you use for renovation?
I'll assume that means when you decide if you need to renovate. I'll give a couple of thoughts with that. If in your field you see bare soil, you're walking through the field and it's yay big, it's the size of a shoe, it's spotted in the field, then I would focus more on resting that field than overseeding. But if you're seeing large areas in the field, this big or a number of square feet in size, then either weeds are going to grow or you need to put some more seed down. And so when you start getting multiple areas that are bigger than kind of these hand sizes, then we're talking about doing a renovation or overseeding. And as Bill commented, once you spray a herbicide, then if you've got a lot of weeds, then you're typically going to open up a lot of bare ground. And so often the follow-up of a herbicide application is overseeding.
You may have already answered this, but the question is, what is the best seed mix for horse pastures? I do not have pregnant mares. My horses are off the track thoroughbreds.
Okay, for off the track thoroughbreds, for pleasure horses, then tall fescue is the hardiest grass that we have as a cool season grass. And orchard grass is a desirable grass, has good shade tolerance. I would go with a mixture of tall fescue and orchard grass. If you ever think you're going to have pregnant mares, then making sure that you're using the novel endophyte tall fescue is going to prevent the issues that you would have. When we look at horse pastures across central Kentucky, even those thoroughbred farms that do not want tall fescue, it occurs on average 20 to 25% of pastures have fescue unless you're aggressively managing against it. But that's fine for pleasure horses. So anyway, fescue, orchard grass, bluegrass is useful as well, but slower to come up. The amount of seed you add, we typically go with horse pasture overseeding of 30 pounds per acre. So that would be something like 15 pounds of fescue and orchard grass and maybe 5 pounds of Kentucky bluegrass. In cattle pastures, we often talk about 20 pounds of total seed is enough, but you've got to be a little more patient with that coming up. So the reason we go with high rates on horse pastures is just give you a little bit better insurance. When you're seeding, if you can seed half the seed in one direction, half the seed in another direction, it's going to cover more ground. You're going to get better establishment. Even though you're covering the field twice, you have a much better chance for establishment. Take a look and read more closely that publication, Establishing Horse Pastures, and it gives more explanation for the benefits and advantages of the different varieties or different species.
Question, what is the best time of year to chain drag pastures?
I'm going to give an answer, and if Dr. Coleman is still on, he might have a follow-up to this. So spreading manure, often at the end of the winter, when the manure piles are there, then dragging helps then. And if you wanted to add some more seed, that could be a benefit to cover the seed in early March. The limitation is in the cooler times of the year, you're also potentially spreading parasite all over the field and having more infection problems in your horses. So the best time to drag as far as killing parasites that would be in that manure would be in the summer. So you spread out those manure piles, and the heat and sunlight kills the parasites. Dr. Coleman, are you still on? Do you have any comments on that?
I am. I think you pretty much got it covered, Dr. Smith. But it is important to spread those manure piles around, not only to break them up so you expose the parasites to heat and light, but also so that the manure piles will break down. Because if you leave them there for very long, they will kill the grass underneath it, and the grass won't come back, but the weeds will. So you need to think about breaking it up and being very judicious. And if you have to break it up, give it some time before you put the horses back on, so that there is an opportunity for any of those parasites to be exposed and go away.
So Bob, maybe a kind of a month after dragging would that be a rule of thumb, or?
Probably, 3 weeks to a month would probably be all right.
Okay.
Dr. Smith, another question. At what temperatures do grasses continue to grow?
So our cool season grasses, they're going to really grow at anything from 40 degrees and up. But once it gets up to about 50 degrees, and that's when they really start growing. So we have consistent temperatures in the 50s. We'll get growth of our existing forages. As Dr. Lawrence mentioned, this winter, we've had a lot of mild days, so we've had growth. Warm season forages that we don't do much planting of those, but the weedy types like the foxtail or crabgrass, the temperatures really are in the 80s before those are growing really good. So that's why our predominant forages in our pastures that we plant and that exist are the cool season forages, because they grow much of the year except the very heat of the summer.
Another question about seeding. You may have answered this, but this is more specific perhaps. For seeding this spring for horse pasture, what grass seed type and percentage of the types of grass would you recommend planting?
So I showed you that example of the orchard grass and its shade tolerance. So to me, a top priority would be making sure that you've got orchard grass in that mixture for spring seeding, particularly unless there's a whole lot of bare soil. The orchard grass is going to handle the shade and come up in between. Kentucky bluegrass, I don't recommend for spring seeding because it's so slow to get started. It's probably not going to get large enough to make it. Or if you do use it, I would go with a very low amount. If you've got more bare area, then that combination of orchard grass and tall fescue, using the improved novel endophyte type tall fescues. If you decide that you've got those bare spots that are always overgrazed, and you're going to say, well, I'm going to put some perennial ryegrass in because you said it comes up quickly, either you go with a very low amount of perennial ryegrass, like just a few pounds per acre, along with the orchard grass and the improved fescue, or you go, if half and half, the perennial ryegrass will overtake the other ones, so they won't get started. So either you go with very low amounts of perennial ryegrass, or you go with 100% perennial ryegrass. Just knowing that it's shorter term stand. Again, a quick fix in the spring is perennial ryegrass. It's just that you don't have the longevity of the others.
Another question about dealing with bare ground. Where does annual ryegrass fit into patching bare ground?
So annual ryegrass is going to come up even quicker and more vigorously than perennial ryegrass. It's just it'll be gone this summer, and so it'll cover the ground. If you plant it in the fall, it's going to grow in the fall real quickly, and it'll live in the spring, but it'll go out in June. If you plant it this spring, it's going to go out probably by July. So it's quicker, comes up quicker, but it's just shorter time period. That's why we usually talk about perennial ryegrass and horse pastures, because it's almost as vigorous getting started, but you got more longevity. some people will mix annual and perennial together, half and half, to kind of get a little bit of both. That's another option. You always risk the annual growing better than the perennial, and then it dies out in the summer. You don't have anything.
Another question, we have a hayfield that we are leasing that has been overgrazed. It's compacted, rough, and mostly weeds, ironweed, Johnson grass, etc. Plan on renovating by plowing, tilling, and reseeding this spring. Should we also apply herbicide before or wait until weed seeds begin to germinate?
So, Bill, what would you say in that really weedy field they want to reestablish?
A couple of things. One, moldboard plowing will be an excellent way to get rid of a lot of ironweed. It won't do any good for the Johnson grass. You may get rid of a few rhizomes, but the seed bank is going to, the number of seed in the soil is going to, tillage doesn't do anything for that. Ideally, is to plow that in the spring and let it go all summer and keep the weeds down during the summer, and then reseed in September. That'd be the best bet to get that under control somewhat. Secondly, if you're going to reseed this spring, the best way to control Johnson grass in pastures is tall fescue. We've just seen that forever. But if you're not wanting tall fescue as a sole grass, then if you could tolerate some tall fescue orchard grass, as you mentioned earlier, Ray, that would be probably the second best. I mean, just from a suppression of Johnson grass, it doesn't do well competing with tall fescue.
And the same, Bill, with nimblewill. Tall fescue competes best with nimblewill.
Yes.
As well. So following up with what Bill just said, by the time the ground is dry enough to do tillage and then seed this spring, unless we have a really dry spell in early March, it may be too late to seed the cool season grasses. And so our recommendation, Bill and I are agreeing that to focus on controlling the weeds and then planting in the fall. And the best way to get the Johnson grass would be spraying Roundup when it starts growing in the summer. So if at all possible, wait until the fall. Now, if they say, if you really need something this summer, then you could plant a crop like oats that will come up quickly, will grow for 2 months and then be gone, but it's going to cover the ground. We don't talk about it in pasture very much, but it can be grazed. Or in that case, annual ryegrass is going to come up quickly, cover the ground, give some cover, and then go into a program of spraying the weeds. And if you want to do tillage as well, then doing that mid to late summer.
Since that is a hayfield, they may be wanting to look at orchard grass more than fescue. I don't know what hayfield grass they want, but a really good, it might even be more important to wait till the fall if you're going to go with orchard grass. And that gives the orchard grass a good time to really have months of growth and filling and density before the following spring, when the ironweed or the Johnson grass would start to germinate.
Mm-hmm. So that question, you all may want to follow up with the county agent, just with kind of the different options, and then they can follow back up with us if they need to, because they obviously get into a number of different scenarios with that.
It was a housekeeping question in terms of will this video be made available? And my understanding, it is being recorded and will be made available on the University of Kentucky Forage's YouTube channel. So if you'd help finding that, you can contact your county agent. Question here, what suggestions do you have for high traffic areas of pasture that have become bare?
Well, ideally, you try to move the traffic another place and plant the perennial forage mixture that we talked about. If it's an area that's always going to be high traffic, then seeding every year or every spring and fall with the perennial ryegrass is a way to cover the soil. Even better, and Dr. Coleman's done a lot of work with this, is putting down filter fabric and dense grade and having a hard pad. Bob, do you want to comment on that? Maybe a good solution to high traffic areas rather than trying to grow grass?
I think that's always the hard part, but think about it. And I know it's going to sound terrible because we're talking about growing grass and having pastures, but if you're putting in a high traffic pad, if it's around a gate or it's a place where you're going to feed a lot, think about how big you need it, and then step back and think if that's big enough. Because if you build it 20 by 20, but you needed it to be 20 by 35, it's really hard to put that other 15 feet in, and you're probably not going to do it. So then you're not going to be happy because it won't function very well. But cleaning out the area, now's a good time to think about where those high traffic pads need to go. You know where the mud is. You can't do much about it now because it's too wet, and you won't get it to compact underneath before you put your fabric down and then your rock. But think about where you want it, and they are a great saver. They can help to keep your horse's shoes on. They can help to keep your boots on, and it can help to keep things from getting stuck as you're trying to go through the gate or go to the areas where you would like to have it somewhat protected. Unless you can move your hay all around your field and then come back and reclaim that ground. If it's a bare ground, it's usually along a fence line. I would go ahead and put in a high traffic pad there. They're not that expensive, and they're actually not that hard to do.
And you could even expand it even larger, and it becomes kind of a dry lot. And then that gives an exercise area for those horses that you don't want on pasture, as Dr. Lawrence was answering the questions with the laminitic type horses. So that's something to think about. It may be better to say, I'm going to have one paddock is going to be a dry lot. I'm not growing anything. And then the other ones, I'm going to try to grow the best forage possible. Anything else, Steve?
Might be it.
Apparently there was a question about forage cubes, hay cubes that I may have missed. Do you have that one, Ben? Forage pellets?
Yes, it was for Dr. Lawrence. In the case of a low requirement, is it possible to feed a horse only forage pellets?
Yes, I responded to the person who sent that one directly back to her, but you can certainly use either forage cubes or forage pellets, particularly as a hay stretcher. One of the concerns is that when you have things that are compressed, either the forage pellets or the forage cubes, generally the amount of time that it takes for the horse to eat those compared to eating long stem hay is less. And so they spend less time eating and less time chewing. And with less time chewing, they have less saliva production, and that could be a potential promoting condition for horses to get ulcers. And of course, if they're spending less time chewing on their food, they may be spending more time chewing on something else. So if you can combine that strategy with pellets or cubes with some other fiber source that's longer, that works well.
Dr. Witt, another late foxtail control in pastures question. How would you manage that?
Yellow foxtail control in late season, is that? I didn't quite catch all of that.
I apologize. What would be a good way to manage undesirable foxtail in pastures?
Well, there's only, as I mentioned, I think currently there are two ways to try that. Prowl H2O is a herbicide that is controls the weed seeds before they control the weeds before they emerge after germination. That one timing is really difficult because we don't know exactly the soil temperature, what soil temperature is under the grass. And that's why I think that the plateau I mentioned in the presentation earlier is a little better option, simply because we can see the foxtail plants after they emerge. And that's going to occur in, depending on the year, mid to late May to early June. But the foxtail needs to be really small. The label says 4 inches or smaller, and 1 or 2 inches is much better. And so you have to be out in the fields looking for it. Look in bare spots to start with. That's where you'll see it first. And once you see it getting to about 1 inch, now that is the time to go spray the plateau.
And I'll add that that's based on recent research with Dr. Witt. So you may not see that in some of the publications, that plateau application. And Bill, you
That's
said
right.
that the 4 to 6 ounces per acre is how much to use. And Bill, if they were going to use prowl to prevent the seed from germinating, then they're probably need to get it out by mid-April.
Mid-April, as you know, we did some research on different timings, and the mid-April is far and away the best time to get control. If you're into May, it's too late, at least on our research trials.
And let me add to that, and Bill, this is a bit of a crude example, but if you put your fingers together and you've got an area of bare soil about that big, then you've got enough sunlight, enough soil warming that if warm season grass seed is there, then it's going to come up. If you can cover the ground, have the grass growing, particularly as you move from spring into summer, keeping that 4-inch stubble height is in having a good cover of ground or grass and clover that's shading the ground, then that's going to be one of the best preventative for those warm season grasses coming up.
It is. Anything you can do to have good coverage, it drastically changes the soil temperature at the surface.
I think that does it for all the questions, it looks like, from the chat box. If we missed anything, feel free to reach out to your county extension agent in your particular county in the future. I thought another one was coming in there. My apologies. A big thanks goes out to the specialists and the speakers tonight, though. Thank you all for providing this information. And a big thanks to all those in attendance. And we wish you nothing but a safe and healthy 2021. And Dr. Smith, Dr. Witt, Dr. Lawrence, I don't think I've missed anything. Any last comments before we call it a night?
Great audience. Thanks everybody for hanging with us. Very good questions.
Excellent questions. Good meeting.
Thank you all so much and have a great night.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.